When you are muzzle conditioning your dog, there are a whole host of issues you can come across, and they don't always have easy solutions. Some dogs are extremely difficult to muzzle condition. Sometimes they're extremely difficult to muzzle condition because they're very, very fearful. Sometimes they're very difficult to muzzle condition because once you get the muzzle on, you realize that they panic because they feel like they've lost some of their senses, and they have a really hard time coping with that. So you have dogs who flail and try to rip the muzzle off and injure themselves. You also have dogs that are highly suspicious or aggressive towards the muzzle. All of these dogs can be very problematic to muzzle condition. We also know, though, that if we don't appropriately muzzle condition, unless we have just a tremendous amount of dog experience or a tremendous amount of physical strength, there's a really high likelihood that the person on the other end is going to get bit. So we have to muzzle condition. It's one of those necessary evils sometimes to take our dogs through the rehabilitation process. So I'm going to show you 2 tips that might help with some of these dogs. So the first tip that I'm going to share with you is for the dogs that really panic once that muzzle gets on them. You've tried everything. You've tried feeding them through it, tried using leash pressure to help settle them, tried pulling their feet off repeatedly, and every time that they try to sniff or engage with something, it almost sets them off again and they go into a full panic. So something that can help the muzzle conditioning process, won't help your safety right now, but it can help the muzzle conditioning process, is by removing the front portion of the muzzle. So if you were to buy a muzzle like this, one of these plastic muzzles, what you can do is you can get, some pliers or something like that. Are you done? Some pliers or something, and clip the front part of this muzzle off, okay? Some people will clip just the front bars off so that this front section's a little more open. Some people will clip this whole front piece off so that it's just this sitting around the nose of the dog, and they can still smell, they can still eat very unencumbered, okay? So you can do that if you feel like that is going to be helpful. Just know that you're sacrificing a muzzle. They're not super expensive, but you will be sacrificing a muzzle because you can't put it back together after that. But that can be beneficial for those dogs that panic when they realize they can't smell, or panic when they realize they can't eat, or get very frustrated trying to eat through the muzzle. This can be a very helpful stepping stone to getting them past that. Now, the other set of dogs, the dogs that are aggressive towards the muzzle or very suspicious towards the muzzle or have had bad experiences towards the muzzle, they're a much more delicate balance. I have found in my career that these dogs will very often get to the point where they will stick their nose in to eat, especially if you're only feeding through the muzzle, so all of their meals come through the muzzle. They'll stick their nose in to eat, but the moment that they sense that your hands are doing anything other than feeding, they either become aggressive or they flip out and they back away from the muzzle so that you can't get the straps on. So the straps becomes a huge trigger for them, and they become highly suspicious. Once they realize that the straps are going to be going over, they stop eating from the muzzle altogether, and you lost all your progress. I've had dogs too that have been aggressive just at the sight of it, but usually when they realize that the food doesn't come any other way through the muzzle, very often that aggression will subside long enough to stick their face in it, but the moment the straps come out, the aggression's all back and there's many issues. So I have had dogs that have been extremely difficult to muzzle condition. It's taken myself months to muzzle condition the dog. Some dogs I've even sent home from board and train still not muzzle conditioned, and had the owners continue the homework, and the owners over several months at home as well were able to muzzle condition the dog. Don't listen to people who are very easily muzzle conditioned their dogs. If you're having a really hard time, you might have a really challenging dog. So just keep that in mind. You're not the only one who has experienced these issues. So something that we have figured out with these dogs that are pretty aggressive toward the muzzle will usually let you do collar counter conditioning easier than they will allow you to do muzzle counter conditioning. So collar counter conditioning would be putting the collar on and off, a collar on and off, a collar on and off. Some dogs are aggressive to that as well, and sometimes you might have to collar condition from back here because they don't like anybody hovering over the front of their face. So you can collar counter condition here. We have a video on collar counter conditioning posted already. That can be very beneficial for getting us to the point of muzzle conditioning. So if I have a dog that's pretty aggressive towards the muzzle, what I will often do is start with touch counter conditioning, getting the dog comfortable with touching. and then start working on some collar counter conditioning, putting that collar on and off, whether they'll let me do it from the back side or the front side, that's up to the dog, but on and off, on and off. What I start to do after that is I start treating the muzzle more like a collar, right? So I'll start collar conditioning, right? Where it has nothing to do with the muzzle coming up over the face at all. It's strictly about collar counter conditioning. Now, if you have a dog that's still really suspicious of this, you can come from the back, and something that you can do is treat it as if it were a collar and then let it dangle down. So you can collar counter condition. Now, once you've had the dog more comfortable with the collar kind of going on and off, what I do is to start making the muzzle much more commonplace. So what I will do to dogs is I will put the muzzle on. They're allowing me to collar the dog now, but that's all they're tolerating. They won't tolerate the muzzle and the collaring concept. So I'll put this on the dog like so, and we'll go do our business. We'll go on our walk for the day. We'll go, eat breakfast for the day or whatever. And this dangles off the dog a large majority of the day, really becoming commonplace. Once that's very commonplace with the dog, what I start doing, if you haven't been doing collar counter conditioning from the front, I'll start doing that from the front. And then I will start slowly changing the way that I put the muzzle on. So before, I was always trying to put the muzzle on with the snoot first and then the strap second, but I'm gonna do it almost backwards now. So I have this dog that's a lot more trusting of me doing this type of stuff. And what I'm going to do is yes, and then I will feed the dog. I'll bring it up and yes, and I'll feed the dog. I'll bring it up and yes, and feed the dog. Bring it up and yes, and feed the dog. And I'll slowly start working on putting it over the nose and feeding the dog. Over the nose and feeding the dog with that YES. Over the nose, feeding the dog with that YES. Over the nose, feeding the dog with that YES. Now, another thing that I will allow them to do very often is I'll allow them to pull it off whenever they want. I'm not gonna fight them on that at all. I'll set it on the nose, and sometimes I'll even have a leash on the dog. I'll try to walk the dog a little bit in it. They'll pull it off. Great, you can pull it off whenever you want. Let them know that. And once we get comfortable here, I'll make the strap one tighter. And then we do the same process. We're on and we're off, and we're on and we're off, and we're on and we're off. Sometimes I'll walk them around in it. Sometimes I'll just leave it on there, see how long they'll tolerate it, right? And then they can pull it off whenever they want. And then I'll make the strap one tighter. Again, this isn't all in one session. This might be over months of working with the dog. But we're on again, just letting it dangle. You might even try feeding through here a little bit like traditional muzzle conditioning, and they can pull it off whenever they want, right? So it's just starting to become something that's very natural and easy for the dog, okay? Then what I start to do is I just keep making it a little bit snugger and start putting it on the dog. I start making it a little bit harder to pull off. Usually by that time, you're a couple months down the road, it's a little bit harder to pull off, but you also notice that the dogs are not panicking nearly as much. They're not as adamant about getting it off. So sometimes they'll paw at it and they just do a weak little paw, and then they're like, it's not coming off super easy, and they leave it on for another 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes, right? And then they're like, okay, I'm really done with this, and then they pull it off, right? But we got 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes where the dog was like, all right, this isn't so bad. Then we can get to the point where we can set it on the nose. The dog's really used to setting it on the nose, and we can go to an even tighter level where it's even harder to pull off. But if they really tried to, they could, right? And then just keeping it there. Usually by the end of a couple of months, you can fully tighten it. The dog is very used to wearing it periodically throughout the day. The dog has very weak, minimal attempts to getting it off. And you can start using this as an actual resource in your training to keep yourself safe and such while you're working with your dog. So it can be a very slow incremental process because you're trying not to damage the dog's trust in you as this is going on. I have found this to work very well. I have been able to recommend owners to be able to do this, even with highly aggressive dogs who are very aggressive towards the muzzle, have been able to do this. Also had a client who created a different variation. They created a hat for their dog. They said their dog was fine if the muzzle was put on like a hat. So they would set it on the dog. I don't remember exactly how, but they would set it on the dog as a hat, and then they were able to slide it down, and he was okay with it. So there's a lot of different ways of going about it, rather than just having it come towards their face, having this be very intimidating. A lot of dogs can be very suspicious about that. Having your hands going up around the neck, that can also be something that's very suspicious for the dog. So there are other ways to go about it. Just know that it does take time. This is one of the reasons why with our board and train dogs, we don't book people immediately. So we have people who call all the time. Even if we had a space tomorrow, we wouldn't allow them to sign up for the space tomorrow. We would say, okay, you have to sign up for the space 3 months from now, because this process can take a while. Getting your dog to the point where they can be safe and manageable and be able to be handed off for board and train can take a while. So there's no rush with this. Just take your time. Keep your dog on leashes inside the house. If you're worried about safety, do a lot more of your crate work and slowly incorporate the muzzle into your training program with the best results possible by just keeping it very non-confrontational.